So I wanted to respond to some of your questions and thinking that you were doing in the beginning of this journey into stone architecture with the Romanesque architecture. When we looked at the aqueduct in Nimes, France, as an early source for this use of arches in stone buildings, some people were asking, why are there multiple levels? And it's really a question of, you need them from a basic standpoint that you can't really build that high, that tall, without subdividing it and having the arches be not one arch going all the way up. That's a practical reason. Robert was wondering what kind of stone was used, which is a great question. I'm not sure that I know enough to speak for every cathedral of the thousands that were built, but commonly they were made of limestone, which is a relatively shapeable stone, as opposed to, say, granite, which would be much harder to carve and shape with using hand tools for a project of this scale. So Oliver had these really thought-provoking questions about the specifics of the engineering, which I love. I don't know how detailed of an answer I can give. He's saying that he's noticing that we have arches using keystones, and the keystones are larger than the voussoirs. And he's wondering if there's a sort of a precise proportion that the keystone needs to be in relationship to these voussoirs. I am absolutely certain there is. My knowledge of stone engineering is not sophisticated enough to say for sure. I do know that in terms of the historical perspective, the stone masons were jealously guarded their knowledge of these kinds of elements of their buildings, such as the proportion of a keystone to voussoir, because this is what made them craftspeople rather than mere peasant laborers. By knowing these things like the proportion, they garnered more respect, more social status, and higher wages than the kind of desperate peasants that you saw in the film Inside the Medieval Mind. And I love this question about another great one is the one that's in your textbook, which shows, if you look carefully, the exhaustion, the bent neck, the sense that these laborers are straining and literally hurting themselves, carrying mortar in this large container up this ladder. So I talked about the skilled craftspeople, the stonemasons, who had a higher status than the lowly laborer. And those are the ones who are more the designers and the overseers of the process. There are still people who are, really their legs are hurting, they're exhausted. If we go back to the cathedral being built dedicated to St. Hedwig, I forgot to mention that we see St. Hedwig here pointing to their work, because their work is, of course, a dedication to her, an offering to her as a saint and to God. It's in her name. And she's talking directly to the king, right? The king is standing there. They're all supervising the labor to understand its importance. And, of course, they're larger. They're at this, in terms of hierarchical scale, where the more important figures are bigger than the smaller figures. They stand like giants against these scrawny little workers. Here's another favorite illustration of the building of a stone cathedral that shows you all sorts of wonderful details, like the guy measuring with the square to make sure the edges are correct, and the guys carrying blocks on their shoulders. And where are they carrying it to? This construction site is Saint-Denis, the burial place of the French kings and the original home of Gothic architecture. And in fact, here we have a king, once again, a king supervising the work and larger in stature than all of these lowly workers. They're like munchkins compared to him, right? And this is actually Dagobert, who is a very ancient French king, back to the Merovingian dynasty, the first king of the Frankish people, so the origins of France, Frankish, to be buried in Saint-Denis. So he's literally buried in there and overseeing that renovation that's happening to have it built into this marvelous cathedral. Interestingly, in terms of the question about quarrying stone, we do see horses drawing a cart with stone. So presumably they could cover some distance. And I would say the primary concern in terms of building the cathedral wasn't pragmatic questions. That might have been a limiting concern, but it was the significance of the site, the significance of the church, as in this case with Dagobert. Back to the aqueduct for a moment. I forgot to address a question that came up from a lot of people. Where was the water? It was on the top level, actually. So these are really support levels. And then here is sort of where you get the water pouring. Oh, and I just realized Kimberly answered that. Awesome, Kimberly. Thank you. So hopefully everyone saw that. And shifting from pragmatics to poetics, I want to point out Raphael's point, which is absolutely on point. The Romanesque arches provide the pointed or arched ceiling that evolves out of our Romanesque arches, provides a better feeling of reaching the heavens. Yes. And he's absolutely right when he says, what I mean by this is that a flat ceiling will probably feel somewhat claustrophobic and restrictive. That's absolutely right. If you look up a flat ceiling, whatever room you're in, presumably you have a flat ceiling, look up and there's a sense of a limit. And then the pointed arch, and most emphatically the pointed arch really does seem to be lifting up to heaven.